Hello friends, get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's drift back to a time before the Spaniards ever arrived. To the world of the Aztecs, where markets bustled, canals shimmered, and life followed the rhythm of the gods. If you enjoy watching this video, please give it a like and subscribe. Before ships with billowing white sails ever appeared on the horizon, Mesoamerica was already buzzing with life. Imagine waking up in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan around the year 1500. The sun climbs above the mountains, spilling gold across the Valley of Mexico. The air smells of maize tortillas cooking, mixed with the earthy smoke of fires. Canoes slide across mirror-like canals, gliding silently like water insects. For the people here, this isn't some exotic wonderland, it's just home. But to the Spaniards who would stumble upon it later, it would look like something out of a dream. Daily life begins early. Farmers called chinampaneros head to their floating gardens, rectangular plots built right into the shallow lake. Picture neat green grids of maize, beans, chilies and squash, with willows at the edges to anchor the soil. These gardens aren't just clever farming, they're a miracle of engineering. From above, the city looks like a chessboard laid across the water. While some men tend crops, others are already fishing, casting nets that glimmer in the sun like silver spiderwebs. The marketplace stirs next. Tlatelolco, the great market of Tenochtitlan, wakes like a giant stretching its limbs. Imagine thousands of voices, hundreds of stalls, the scent of roasted cacao beans mingling with dried chilies. A vendor haggles over turquoise stones. Another sells feather cloaks, shimmering green and blue like trapped rainbows. Over here, pyramids of maize. Over there, clay pots, obsidian knives sharp enough to shave with. And the noise, hawkers shouting, drummers pounding, kids darting between stalls. If you've ever been to a modern flea market, multiply that by 10 and you'll get close. Life wasn't all work and trade. Festivals filled the Aztec calendar. Some were solemn, some wild, and most were loud. Imagine streets lined with dancers in jaguar skins and feather headdresses, stomping to the beat of massive drums. Priests chant as incense curls up in smoky spirals, thick with the smell of copal. Children laugh, chasing one another between the legs of costumed performers. It's part circus, part ceremony, and part cosmic insurance policy, because every ritual is meant to keep the sun moving across the sky. And then, towering above it all, stand the temples. The Templo Mayor rises like a mountain of stone, its twin staircases climbing toward the gods. At the top, smoke from offerings drifts into the blue, meant for Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, and Tlaloc, the rainbringer. For the Aztecs, these aren't just buildings, they're the very centre of the universe. Think of them like cosmic radio towers, sending prayers skyward and keeping the balance between humans and gods. Water was everywhere. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a city on a lake, it was a city in the lake. Canals ran like watery streets, crossed by wooden bridges. Canoes moved in steady traffic, carrying firewood, food, and passengers. Spanish chroniclers later compared it to Venice, though to the Aztecs, Venice would have just seemed like a shabby cousin. Here, the water shimmered, the city reflected in the ripples like a jewel floating on the lake's surface. At night, the city changed but never slept. Torches lit the streets, throwing gold light on painted murals. Musicians strummed shell trumpets and flutes, filling the air with sound both eerie and beautiful. Families gathered around meals of maize tamales, beans and chili stews. Chocolate drinks, thick, bitter and frothy, passed from hand to hand. Some drank it warm, others cold, but all believed it gave energy from the gods. Forget energy drinks. The Aztecs were way ahead. Social life was layered like the steps of a pyramid. At the top were nobles and priests wrapped in rich cotton cloaks with elaborate designs. Below them were merchants and warriors, still respected but with less fancy capes. Most people were common farmers, fishers and artisans, the heartbeat of the city. And then there were the Pochteca, long-distance merchants, who travelled dangerous roads to bring back rare goods. They weren't just traders, they were spies too, slipping secrets back to the emperor. Little James Bond with a feathered cloak. Tenochtitlan was massive. Estimates suggest around 200,000 people lived there, making it larger than most European cities at the time. Wide causeways connected it to the mainland. Aqueducts carried fresh spring water in graceful arches. Public baths dotted the city, where people scrubbed with soap made from plants. It was clean, organised and stunning. One Spaniard later wrote that even in Spain nothing compared. That must have stung a little for the folks back home. To the people living there it was normal. Just another day of farming, trading, praying and laughing. But to us looking back, it feels like a world balanced on the edge of history. Because soon ships would appear, men in armour would march, and the rhythms of life, the markets, the festivals, the canals, the songs, would never be the same again. If you lived in Tenochtitlan, you didn't just wake up thinking about farming or shopping at the market. You also thought about the gods. For the Aztecs, the world wasn't just something that existed on its own. It had to be constantly fed, balanced and negotiated with. Life was like a deal with the universe. You give, you get. And what you gave wasn't just prayers or incense. Sometimes it was blood. The Aztec pantheon wasn't small, it was crowded. Hundreds of gods covering everything from the sun to rain, from cornfields to childbirth. The big stars were Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, Tlaloc, the rain god, and Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent who brought knowledge and wind. Each one demanded attention, and if you ignored them, well, better not to find out. To the Aztecs, the sun literally wouldn't rise without the right rituals. Imagine waking up and thinking better offer blood today or else no sunshine. That's some serious responsibility. Now let's talk about sacrifice. Yes, it's the part everyone remembers, but let's set the tone right. It wasn't some random act of cruelty, it was cosmic maintenance. Just like you put gas in a car to keep it running, the Aztecs offered blood to keep the universe moving. Priests believed the gods had sacrificed themselves first, bleeding to create the world. Humans, in return, had to give back. It was a two-way street, only with a lot more drums and feathered costumes. Sacrifices weren't always deadly. People also offered small cuts on their ears, tongues or legs, dripping a few drops of blood onto paper or into fires. It was like paying a little tax to the gods. But on the big festival days, that was when captives, usually prisoners of war, were chosen for the ultimate gift. Imagine the crowd in the plaza, drums pounding like thunder, incense thick, and all eyes turned toward the temple stairs. It wasn't a quiet ritual, it was a cosmic performance. The flower wars were even fought just to capture people for sacrifice. Neighbouring city-states would agree to battle, not for land, but for prisoners. Sounds strange, but for the Aztecs, it made sense. The empire was like a giant machine, always needing more fuel, and while some captives met their fate on temple steps, others lived on, adopted into families, or trained as warriors. It wasn't always doom. Still, the system kept resentment simmering among those forced to pay tribute in crops, gold, or human lives. Tlaloc, the rain god, had his own special rituals. Children were sometimes chosen for him, not because the Aztecs were cruel, but because their tears were thought to call the rains. The higher the crying, the better for the fields. Morbid? Sure. But in a world where drought could starve thousands, people believed it was worth the sacrifice. It's unsettling to us, but to them, it was survival math. And yet, Aztec religion wasn't just about blood. It was also about beauty, music, and poetry. Temples echoed with conch shells, flutes and drums. Poets sang verses about the shortness of life, comparing humans to flowers that bloom and then wither. One famous line goes, "We only rise from sleep, we come only to dream. It is not true that we come to live on earth." Kind of heavy, but also strangely comforting. They knew life was fragile, which made every song, every dance, every meal feel more precious. The empire itself was stitched together by religion. Subject cities paid tribute not just in goods, but in loyalty to the Aztec gods. Tribute lists were long: cacao, jade, textiles, feathers, corn, even rubber balls. Imagine wagon loads of goods arriving from hundreds of miles away, all funneled into Tenochtitlan. The capital grew rich while its neighbours grew resentful. To many city-states, the Aztecs looked less like holy guardians and more like cosmic bullies. Moctezuma, the emperor, was seen as the living representative of the gods. People bowed, avoided eye contact, and brought him gifts without being asked. He wasn't just a king, he was a kind of bridge between humans and the divine. But that also meant huge pressure. Imagine being told, "Hey, the sun won't rise unless you keep up with rituals." That's a heavy job description. So picture it, a world where the gods weren't just background characters. They were everywhere, in the crops you planted, in the rain on your roof, in the very beating of your heart. Every song, every drumbeat, every offering tied people to the universe. It was beautiful, terrifying, and ordinary all at once. The Aztecs didn't live in fear, they lived in rhythm, sure that as long as they kept their side of the deal, the sun would rise tomorrow. Long before the Spaniards showed up in the heart of Mexico, the Aztecs were already nervous. Strange things began happening in the years leading up to 1519, things people didn't quite understand. A temple burned without reason. A comet streaked across the night sky, bright as a torch, refusing to fade. Fishermen swore they saw glowing lights dancing over the lake at midnight. To us, these might sound like natural events. To the Aztecs, they were cosmic warning signs, the kind you don't ignore. The empire's priests pored over their codices, folded books painted with symbols of gods and past events, searching for meaning. They saw patterns in everything. A sudden illness? Maybe Tlaloc was angry. A bright light in the sky? Maybe Huitzilopochtli had sent a signal, and when several omens stacked up one after another, it started to feel like the universe itself was whispering, something big is coming. Word then drifted inland from the Gulf Coast. Strange houses had appeared floating on the sea, white and tall like mountains, but moving. Locals described them with wide eyes. They had wings like giant birds and carried men with shining skins. Horses too, but the animals looked monstrous. Creatures no one had ever seen before. News of these floating mountains travelled fast, carried by messengers who ran along the causeways, pausing only to catch their breath before sprinting again. Moctezuma, the emperor, listened carefully to these reports. He wasn't a man quick to dismiss omens. In fact, he was known for caution, even hesitation. When told about the strangers, he grew thoughtful. Were they gods? Were they men? Or were they both? After all, their arrival seemed to line up with prophecies about the return of a powerful figure, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who long ago had left toward the east. Could these pale strangers be his messengers? In coastal villages, the first glimpses of Spaniards caused more confusion than fear. Imagine standing on the shore watching ships glide closer, sails full of wind creaking like giant skeletons. Out step men in metal helmets that catch the sun, flashing like mirrors. They carry long sticks that roar with smoke and fire. Their beards are thick, their clothes heavy, and they ride beasts that thunder across the sand. For people who had never seen a horse, it looked like man and animal were fused into one terrifying creature. But these weren't just scary strangers. They also carried shiny objects that dazzled the locals. Glass beads, colourful cloth, and especially iron blades sharper than obsidian. Gifts were exchanged, sometimes peacefully, sometimes tensely, and slowly rumours turned into stories, and stories turned into legends. By the time word reached Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards weren't just foreigners anymore. They were supernatural, dangerous, and possibly divine. Meanwhile, the Spaniards were just as fascinated by what they saw. To them, the coast of Mexico was like stepping into a strange dream, filled with fruits they had never tasted, birds with feathers brighter than stained glass, and people who spoke 1,000 languages. But the Spaniards weren't here just to trade. They were looking for something else, gold. And when the first bits of gold passed from hand to hand, Cortés and his men leaned in with hungry eyes. That was the kind of rumour they liked best. Back in Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma ordered his priests to double their rituals. More incense, more prayers, more sacrifices, anything to steady the universe. But the truth was, no ritual could quiet the growing unease. Every new report made the strangers sound larger than life. Men with thunder sticks, beasts with hooves, ships like castles. The Empire's warriors were brave, but how do you prepare for enemies you don't understand? Ordinary people whispered too. In the markets, between piles of maize and cacao, merchants muttered that the end of the fifth sun might be near. Mothers hushed their children when the talk got too dark. Fishermen stared at the horizon, half expecting the sea itself to split open and swallow the land. Rumours moved faster than canoes, and like smoke they couldn't be contained. For now, though, the strangers remained on the coast, still far from the shining heart of the empire. The canals of Tenochtitlan still bustled, festivals still roared with music, and the sun still rose on schedule. But beneath the noise of daily life, a quiet dread crept in. Something had shifted. The Aztecs didn't know it yet, but the world they had always known was already tilting toward its end. Before he ever set foot in Mexico, Hernán Cortés was just a restless Spaniard with a taste for risk. Born in 1485 in a small town called Medellin in the region of Extremadura, Cortés wasn't the kind of guy who looked destined for greatness. He wasn't rich, he wasn't noble in any grand way, and frankly, he spent a lot of his youth getting into trouble. He studied law for about 5 minutes before deciding classrooms weren't for him. Adventure sounded better than textbooks. Spain at the time was buzzing with stories of the New World. Columbus had sailed west, islands had been claimed, and gold was being whispered about in every tavern. For a young man with big ambition and not much else, this was like hearing there was free treasure just lying around across the ocean. Cortés signed up for voyages and eventually found himself in the Caribbean, learning the ropes of conquest one skirmish at a time. By the time Cortés was in his early 30s, he'd built a reputation, clever, persuasive, and just a little slippery. He could talk his way out of trouble, charm allies, and when needed, bend the rules without breaking them. At least, not completely. He wasn't the strongest soldier or the most pious Christian, but he had something else. Nerve. And in the New World, nerve counted for a lot. In 1518, the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, put Cortés in charge of an expedition to explore the mainland of Mexico. At first, it was supposed to be about trade, diplomacy, and maybe poking around for some gold. But Cortés, being Cortés, saw more. He wasn't thinking small. He was already imagining cities of stone, treasures piled high, and an empire waiting for him to take. Of course, Velázquez started to worry. Cortés was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. He began to suspect his new captain might go rogue. At the last minute, Velázquez tried to cancel the mission, but Cortés, he didn't exactly stick around to hand in his paperwork. Instead, he loaded his ships in secret, gathered his men, and sailed out before the governor could stop him. Classic Cortés move. Ask forgiveness later, never permission now. Cortés set out with about 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. Not exactly a massive army. But he had something better than numbers. He had determination and a knack for persuasion. He promised his men riches, glory, and land. Most of them were adventurers too, ready to risk it all for even a handful of gold. Imagine the mood. Nervous, excited, seasick, and fueled by dreams of treasure. One of his most infamous decisions came early. He burned his ships. Well, technically, he scuttled them so his men couldn't sail back to Cuba. Either way, the message was clear. There was no turning back. You're either in this with me, or you're swimming home. Bold, yes. A little dramatic, definitely. But it locked his men into the mission with no escape. Cortés wasn't all fire and bravado, though. He was calculating. He quickly realized that to survive in this new land, he needed allies. The Spanish were few, the locals were many, so he began negotiating, making deals, and when that didn't work, showing off his cannons and horses to scare people into cooperation. It was carrot and stick diplomacy, with a lot of smoke and noise from the stick side. One of the biggest turning points for Cortés was meeting La Malintzin, a young woman who could speak both Nahuatl and Maya. Through her, and with the help of a Spanish priest who knew Maya and Spanish, Cortés suddenly had a voice. Malinche wasn't just a translator, she was a strategist, a diplomat, and a guide. Without her, Cortés might have stumbled into disaster. With her, he could speak to rulers, win allies, and understand the complex politics of the land. So who was Hernán Cortés? He wasn't the strongest, the richest, or even the most loyal subject of Spain, but he was persistent, ambitious, and clever in a way that often made the difference between failure and victory. If you had asked him then, he probably wouldn't have called himself reluctant. But history remembers him that way because at first he wasn't meant to conquer an empire. Yet step by step, decision by decision, that's exactly what he was about to do. When Cortés and his men first stepped onto the sandy shores of Mexico in 1519, they weren't just strangers. They were like visitors from another world. Their metal helmets glinted in the sun, their horses pawed at the ground impatiently, and their cannons stood like silent beasts waiting to roar. The local Totonac people watched from a distance, unsure if they were dealing with men, gods, or something in between. The Spaniards, meanwhile, were just happy to stretch their legs and complain about the heat. The Totonacs were among the first to make contact. They were tired of Aztec demands for tribute, so when Cortés appeared, shiny and loud, they saw an opportunity. Cortés, always the smooth talker, played the part of a powerful leader. He gave gifts, glass beads, mirrors, a few trinkets, and in return received food, feathers, and cautious friendship. The Aztecs had bullied the Totonacs for years. Now, here was a strange new force to possibly tip the balance. Of course, the Spaniards also shocked the locals in ways they couldn't have planned. Horses were a big one. To the Totonacs, these animals looked like mythical creatures, half man, half beast. Soldiers sat high in the saddle, towering over crowds. When one horse neighed and reared, villagers gasped, some dropping what they held. Cortés quickly used this to his advantage, staging little parades to show off his strange companions. You could almost see him thinking, "Yep, let's lean into the god rumours." Then came the thundersticks, muskets and cannons. The first time the Spaniards fired them, smoke filled the air, the ground shook and birds scattered from the trees. Totonac warriors dropped to their knees, stunned. Obsidian blades were sharp, yes, but they didn't make thunder. Cortés didn't waste the moment. He reminded the locals in so many words that he came with both friendship and firepower. A choice, really. Ally with me or face these new weapons. But it wasn't all intimidation. There were moments of comedy too. The Spaniards wore heavy armour in the blazing tropical heat, and sometimes had to peel off their helmets just to breathe. Locals laughed quietly at these sweaty, pale newcomers, who looked tough but wilted like overcooked vegetables under the sun. Cortés, for all his confidence, probably pretended he wasn't melting inside his metal suit. Language, of course, was another hurdle. Cortés relied on translators. First Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spaniard who had lived with the Maya and learned their language, and then Malintzin, the woman who could bridge Nahuatl and Maya. With their help, messages went from Nahuatl to Maya to Spanish, a three-step relay race of words. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Through this chain of voices, Cortés began weaving alliances. Without Malintzin, his story would have ended on the beach. Soon, the Spaniards were invited into Totonac villages. They were given food, turkeys, maize cakes, and chocolate drinks whipped until frothy. To the Europeans, chocolate was bitter and strange, but they drank it anyway, hoping for the energy the locals promised it gave. Meanwhile, the Totonacs marvelled at Spanish steel swords, trying to trade piles of feathers and food just for one blade. Both sides were testing each other, weighing trust against suspicion. But word of these pale strangers didn't stay local. Aztec officials soon heard about Cortés and demanded the Totonacs pay tribute to Tenochtitlan as usual. Cortés, smelling opportunity, stepped in. He encouraged the Totonacs to resist, promising protection. This was the spark of something bigger. The Spaniards weren't just visitors anymore. They were inserting themselves into local politics, and the cracks in Aztec power began to widen. Still, not every encounter went smoothly. Some villages resisted, hurling spears and stones at the newcomers. In those moments, Spanish steel and gunpowder proved deadly. Horses charged through defenders, cannons roared, and obsidian blades shattered against iron shields. Victories were quick but brutal, and each one left a message. These newcomers were dangerous, but also powerful allies if you chose the right side. By the time Cortés set up his base in Veracruz, he had secured a toehold in Mexico. He was no longer just a rogue captain who had defied his governor. He was now a player in a much bigger game, with allies, enemies, and eyes watching from the great city of Tenochtitlan. For the Aztecs, the rumours from the sea were no longer just rumours. The strangers had landed, and they weren't leaving. In the story of the conquest, Hernán Cortés gets most of the headlines, but behind him, shaping almost every decision, stood a woman named Malintzin. To some, she was a hero, to others, a traitor. But no matter how you see her, one fact is certain. Without her, Cortés would have been just another lost Spaniard, probably swallowed up by the jungles of Mexico. Malintzin was the voice that carried his words, the bridge that made his plans possible. Her story began long before the Spaniards landed. Malintzin was born around 1500 to a noble family in the region of Coatzacoalcos, near the Gulf Coast. But her childhood took a sharp turn. After her father's death, her mother remarried and, in a brutal twist, gave Malintzin away to traders. She was sold into slavery, passed from one group to another, and eventually ended up among the Maya. By the time she met Cortés, she could speak both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya. Fate had trained her for this exact moment. When Cortés defeated a Maya town early in his campaign, he was given a group of women as part of the peace offering. Among them was Malintzin. At first she seemed like just another servant, but soon her gift became clear. With Jerónimo de Aguilar translating between Spanish and Maya, and Malintzin translating between Maya and Nahuatl, suddenly conversations flowed. What had been a wall of silence turned into a chain of voices. Cortés had found his key, but Malintzin was more than just a mouthpiece. She was sharp. She understood the politics of the land, the rivalries between city-states, the fear of Aztec domination, and the opportunities hidden in every negotiation. She didn't just pass along words, she advised, she explained, she interpreted meaning. Cortés leaned on her not only to speak, but to think. For many indigenous peoples, Malintzin became the familiar face of the Spaniards. She was the one who spoke their tongue, who explained these strange newcomers, who gave orders on their behalf. In some ways, she softened their image. In others, she made the Spaniards' power even more effective. When she spoke, people listened, not because she was loud, but because she carried the weight of two worlds at once. Of course, history hasn't always been kind to her. Later generations called her La Malinche, a name that sometimes meant traitor. She was accused of helping the Spaniards bring down her own people. But think about her position. She'd been enslaved, given away, and had little power over her fate. By aligning with Cortés, she didn't just survive. She rose to a place of influence no other woman of her time could have dreamed of. Her choices weren't simple. Survival never is. Cortés himself recognized her value. He trusted her completely, sometimes more than he trusted his Spanish captains. She was always by his side through battles, alliances, and tense negotiations. When the Spaniards entered new towns, it was Malintzin who smoothed the way with her voice. When Tlaxcalans debated whether to kill the strangers or join them, it was Malintzin who helped convince them. She wasn't just translating words, she was translating trust. Her personal life intertwined with this story too. She bore a son by Cortés, one of the first mixed heritage children of the New World, symbolizing the merging of two cultures, though not in a peaceful way. Later she married a Spanish noble and continued to live within colonial society. Through her, two worlds literally came together, for better or worse. What's most striking is how calm she seems to have been through it all. Accounts describe her as quiet but commanding, someone who didn't waste words but knew how to use them. She was like a thread running through this conquest, tying conversations, alliances, and decisions into one continuous story. Without her, the Spaniards would have been stumbling in the dark. With her, they had a torch. So when you picture Cortés marching inland, remember he didn't walk alone. Malintzin walked with him, speaking for him, shaping the path before him. Some called her a traitor, others a survivor, but maybe she was something even more complex. A woman caught between worlds, forced to make choices in impossible circumstances, and in the process becoming one of the most important voices in history. The march inland began like a parade and a gamble all at once. Cortés and his small army of Spaniards, horses clattering on stone paths, moved away from the safety of the coast. Alongside them walked Malintzin, local guides, and the Totonac allies, who had thrown their lot in with these strange newcomers. Every step carried them closer to the heart of the Aztec world, and deeper into danger. The jungle gave way to valleys, the valleys to mountains, and with every mile more eyes watched them from the trees. The terrain itself felt like an opponent. Rivers had to be crossed, mountains climbed, and food gathered from wherever they could. Some nights soldiers slept in damp clothes, clutching their weapons as insects buzzed endlessly. Horses sank in muddy trails, cannons got stuck in ravines, and tempers flared. The Spaniards grumbled, wondering if the gold they dreamed of would really be worth all this. Cortés kept them moving with promises. Just ahead, riches, just ahead, glory. But not everyone welcomed them. In the highlands, villages sometimes greeted the Spaniards with wary curiosity, or with spears. Skirmishes flared. The clash of obsidian blades against steel rang through the valleys. Muskets cracked, smoke rising into the thin air, and every time the Spaniards won, their reputation as unstoppable grew a little more. To the locals, they looked less like men and more like a storm sweeping through the land. One of the most important encounters came with the Tlaxcalans. Fierce warriors, bitter enemies of the Aztecs. They weren't exactly thrilled to see the Spaniards walking across their land. They attacked with full force, hoping to crush these strangers before they could become a problem. Battles raged for days, with thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors swarming against the tiny Spanish force. It looked like the end, but somehow, through steel, horses and the steady voice of Malintzin, the Spaniards held on. And then, something remarkable happened. Instead of finishing the Spaniards off, the Tlaxcalans pulled back and reconsidered. They hated the Aztecs, who had demanded tribute and taken their people for sacrifice for years. Suddenly, the Spaniards didn't look like enemies. They looked like potential allies. Cortés seized the chance. He met with Tlaxcalan leaders, spoke through Malintzin, and offered an alliance. Fight with me against the Aztecs, and we can bring down your oppressors together. The deal was struck. Tlaxcala, once the fiercest opponent, became Cortés's strongest ally. Thousands of warriors joined the Spaniards, swelling their numbers far beyond what they could have dreamed. Cortés now marched not with a few hundred soldiers, but with an army of thousands. The road to Tenochtitlan was opening, paved not by steel alone, but by alliances born of resentment and strategy. The march itself became a spectacle. Villagers along the way came out to watch the strange procession. Armoured men glinting in the sun, horses snorting and stamping, drums from Tlaxcalan allies beating a steady rhythm. Some locals offered food, others whispered prayers, and many just stared, unsure whether to cheer or hide. To them, this wasn't just an army. It was a moving omen, a sign that the world was shifting. Cortés made sure to play the part of a leader destined for greatness. He held himself tall, gave stirring speeches, and leaned heavily on Malintzin to deliver his words with precision and authority. She explained promises of freedom from Aztec tribute, of new alliances, of a future where the sun might rise on different masters. For many city-states, the message was tempting. The Aztec Empire was powerful, but it wasn't loved. Still, every night by the campfires, the Spaniards whispered their own fears. Could they really face the mighty Tenochtitlan? Would these allies stick with them, or turn the moment things got tough? Some soldiers dreamed of gold, others of death. Horses whinnied in the dark, drums echoed from distant hills, and the sense of destiny, heavy and unstoppable, pressed on their shoulders. They were marching not just into the heart of Mexico, but into the unknown. And so the march continued step by step, village by village, until the mountains opened to reveal the vast valley where the Aztec capital waited. Ahead lay glittering waters, floating gardens, and the greatest city in the Americas. Cortés and his men could see it in the distance now. Tenochtitlan, like a jewel rising from the lake. The march was over. The real encounter was about to begin. While Cortés and his allies trudged inland, in the shining capital of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II sat in his palace, listening. Messengers came in waves, each one carrying news that made his brow crease a little deeper. Pale men had landed on the coast. They rode beasts that thundered. They carried sticks that spat fire. They were gathering allies, and they were marching closer. Moctezuma, ruler of millions, a man used to commanding with a word, found himself staring into the unknown. Moctezuma wasn't just any emperor. He had been chosen years before for his intelligence, his piety, and his noble blood. Tall, dignified, wrapped in cotton robes woven with jewels, he carried himself like someone who spoke directly to the gods. His word was law, his presence overwhelming. But beneath that regal surface he was deeply religious and cautious. He believed in omens, in signs, in the thin thread that held the cosmos together. For years he had ruled the empire with a firm hand. Tribute poured in from conquered cities, cacao, feathers, jade, gold, and people destined for sacrifice. Nobles bowed low, warriors marched at his command, priests performed rituals to keep the sun rising. To most, Moctezuma looked like the very centre of the universe, the one man tying gods and mortals together. But power, as always, came with fear. He knew resentment simmered among the empire's subjects, and now pale strangers were feeding that resentment. Moctezuma's council split into factions. Some nobles urged immediate war. Crush the strangers now before they gain strength. Others counselled patience. Watch, learn, wait for the right moment. Priests reminded everyone of prophecies, stories that one day Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, would return from the east, and the strangers had inconveniently come from the east. Moctezuma sat in silence as voices rose around him. To fight, to wait, to welcome, every choice carried risk. In his palace gardens, Moctezuma walked alone among exotic birds and fragrant flowers, weighing the choices. He was said to keep animals, jaguars, eagles, serpents, in cages, symbols of his dominion. And yet, for all his power, he hesitated. He was a man who could command armies with a gesture, yet he found himself paralysed by uncertainty. Perhaps it was wisdom, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the weight of carrying an empire on his shoulders. Meanwhile, more omens pressed on his mind. A temple had burned without cause. A comet blazed across the sky. Fishermen spoke of monsters in the lake. Priests whispered that the gods themselves were restless. To us, it's easy to chalk these up to natural events. But to Moctezuma, who had spent his life listening to the rhythm of signs, they felt like a chorus shouting, "Change is coming." And change rarely arrived gently. Moctezuma's solution for now was diplomacy. He sent gifts to the strangers, golden ornaments, fine cloaks, precious stones. If they were gods, perhaps they would be honoured. If they were men, perhaps they would be satisfied. But Cortés, of course, wasn't satisfied. The gifts only confirmed what he already hoped. This was a land of immense wealth, waiting to be taken. As the Spaniards drew closer, Moctezuma grew more withdrawn. Some said he stopped eating, fasting to seek guidance from the gods. He spoke less in council, listening instead to priests and seers. His hesitation spread like a shadow, making nobles nervous. An emperor who paused too long could look weak. But Moctezuma wasn't weak. He was cautious, deeply aware that rash choices could bring disaster. The tragedy is that waiting brought disaster too. To the people of Tenochtitlan, though, life went on. The markets bustled, children splashed in the canals, festivals roared with drums and dancing. But beneath the music and the colour, whispers spread. Who were these pale men? Why did the emperor look so troubled? Could it be the end of the fifth sun, the collapse of the world they knew? Ordinary people didn't have answers, only rumours. And rumours, as always, grew louder than facts. Moctezuma stood at the centre of it all. Emperor, priest, warrior, and yet a man wrestling with doubt. His empire was vast, his armies strong, but his heart was heavy with omens and fear. History would remember him as hesitant, uncertain. But perhaps he was simply human, caught between faith and duty, staring at the horizon where strangers marched closer every day, knowing that soon everything would change. The march had been long. Mountains climbed, valleys crossed, alliances forged in fire and blood. But then, one morning, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies reached a ridge that overlooked the Great Valley of Mexico. The soldiers stopped in their tracks, jaws open, helmets tilted back. Below them stretched a vast shimmering lake, dotted with floating gardens, causeways stretching like arms, and in the very middle, a city unlike anything they had ever seen. This was Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztec world. For men who came from dusty Spanish towns, the sight was almost unbelievable. Wide stone causeways cut across the lake, leading straight into the shining city. White temples rose like mountains of carved stone. Canals glinted like silver ribbons. Smoke curled lazily from thousands of cooking fires. Birds wheeled above, their wings flashing colour in the sunlight. It didn't look like a city built by men. It looked like something dreamed into existence. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's soldiers, later wrote that it was like seeing something out of fairy tales. The Spaniards whispered to each other, "Venice? No, greater than Venice. Rome? No, greater than Rome." The comparison was inevitable. They had expected huts, maybe villages. Instead, they were staring at a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people, larger than most European capitals of the time. And here they were, a ragtag band of strangers, standing on the doorstep of an empire. As they descended into the valley, the Spaniards passed through towns filled with chinampas, floating gardens. Rectangular plots of green maize, beans and chilies floated on the lake, framed by willow trees. Farmers in canoes tended their crops, their paddles cutting smoothly through the water. To the Spaniards it was both alien and ingenious. Back home they fought rocky soil and dry plains. Here the earth itself seemed to bloom from the water. And then, as they reached the causeway leading into the city, a procession appeared. Priests in feathered cloaks, nobles in fine cotton, and attendants carrying banners of brilliant colour. At the centre, in regal calm, stood Moctezuma II himself. He had decided not to fight, not yet. Instead, he would welcome the strangers, cautiously, ceremoniously, with all the dignity of an emperor. His arrival silenced even the restless Spanish horses. The meeting of Cortés and Moctezuma is one of those moments where history seems to hold its breath. Cortés, dusty from travel, armour dulled but gleaming, stepped forward. Moctezuma extended gifts, golden necklaces, cloaks shimmering with quetzal feathers, the kind of wealth the Spaniards had only imagined. Cortés in return offered cheap glass beads and a crucifix. The exchange said it all. Two worlds colliding, one dazzled by glittering metal, the other blind to its own value. The Spaniards were escorted across the causeway into Tenochtitlan. The closer they came, the more impossible it all seemed. Streets wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast. Bridges crossing canals alive with canoes. Whitewashed houses, temples and palaces shining in the sun. Gardens spilling over with flowers. Markets buzzing like hives. Even the air felt different, carrying the smell of maize, roasted cacao and incense. For men who had crossed an ocean chasing gold, this city was richer than their dreams. Cortés and his men were housed in one of the city's palaces, their every need attended to. But beneath the hospitality, tension hummed. The Spaniards looked around in awe but also suspicion. They whispered about treasures hidden in the temples, about the riches of the empire. Meanwhile, Moctezuma's nobles watched them just as carefully. Were these strangers guests, prisoners, gods, or wolves who had wandered into the heart of the flock? At night, torches flickered on the canals, their light dancing across the water. Spaniards leaned on balconies, staring at the endless city stretching in every direction. Even the most hardened soldier felt a tremor of awe. They whispered, "How could we ever conquer this?" But Cortés, ever ambitious, saw not just the city's power, but its cracks. The resentment of conquered peoples, the whispers of tribute too heavy, the hesitations of an emperor caught in prophecy. To him, the city was not just beautiful, it was vulnerable. The first glimpse of Tenochtitlan left the Spaniards spellbound. To them, it was like entering a dream, a city rising from the waters like a mirage. To the Aztecs, it was simply home, the centre of their world, alive and strong. But in that moment, as two worlds stood face to face in the city of canals and temples, the fate of an empire hung silently in the air. At first, the Spaniards in Tenochtitlan lived like honoured guests. Moctezuma had given them a palace to stay in. Wide courtyards, painted walls, servants bringing food and gifts. Cortés's men feasted on maize cakes, turkey and cacao drinks, staring in wonder at the endless streams of tribute flowing into the city. But beneath the luxury, unease ran deep. Guests they might be, but the Spaniards were also surrounded by canals, by temples, and by thousands of watchful eyes. The city itself seemed alive, humming around them. Markets swelled with noise, temples smoked with incense, and festivals shook the air with drums. Spaniards wandered the streets under guard, marvelling at painted murals and shimmering feather cloaks, but always aware of whispers at their backs. Were they admired, feared, or despised? Even when they lay down at night, the thought nagged. They were deep inside the Aztec capital. A palace could turn into a prison at any moment. Cortés, however, never lost his nerve. Where his men saw danger, he saw opportunity. He studied the city like a chessboard, the causeways, the canals, the temples, the movements of guards, and he made a decision so daring it bordered on madness. If the Spaniards were to survive, they had to control Moctezuma himself. Better to hold the emperor in his own palace than risk being swallowed by the city around them. The plan was bold. Cortés invited Moctezuma to visit the Spanish quarters, under the guise of strengthening their friendship. Moctezuma, cautious but curious, agreed. When he arrived, Spaniards closed the doors, surrounding him with steel. Calmly, Cortés explained that for everyone's safety, the emperor would remain as their guest. It was framed as hospitality, but everyone knew the truth. Moctezuma, ruler of millions, had become a prisoner in his own city. Strangely, Moctezuma did not resist. Perhaps he hoped compliance would protect his people. Perhaps he believed fighting would only bring ruin. So he remained in the Spaniards' care, treated with respect, given luxuries, even allowed to speak with his nobles, but always under watch. To outsiders it looked surreal, the emperor still issuing orders, still dressed in finery, but walking with an invisible chain around his neck. For the Spaniards, it was the boldest stroke of luck. With Moctezuma in their grasp, they gained leverage over the empire. Orders he gave under their watch were obeyed, because few dared to question the emperor's voice. Cortés used this to demand gold and tribute, which poured into their quarters until the rooms glittered with treasure. Soldiers who had nearly mutinied on the march now grinned at the sight of gold bars and ornaments. But beneath the wealth, resentment simmered. Among the Aztec nobles, anger grew. How could their emperor live as a captive? How could he appear in public escorted by strangers? Whispers turned into shouts in the marketplace. Priests muttered that the gods were displeased. To ordinary citizens it looked like humiliation, and humiliation was dangerous. Tenochtitlan was a city of pride, and pride could turn to fury in an instant. Meanwhile, the Spaniards strained under the tension. They were few, surrounded by tens of thousands. Even with Moctezuma in their grasp, they knew one spark could ignite the city against them. Cortés walked a razor's edge, balancing hospitality and intimidation, promises and threats. His men sharpened their swords at night, listening to the city's heartbeat through the walls. The air itself felt charged, waiting. And yet, for a brief moment, an uneasy peace held. Spaniards and Aztecs walked the same streets, traded glances in the same markets, shared food, music, and cautious conversation. Moctezuma himself played host, speaking softly to Cortés, offering gifts, maintaining dignity even in captivity. It was a strange balance, two worlds colliding yet bound together in fragile calm like a lake before a storm. But under that calm, danger boiled. The Spaniards had pulled off an impossible feat, turning guests into masters, turning an emperor into their shield. Yet they sat at the centre of a city larger than any they had known, watched by thousands who longed to see them gone. Moctezuma was their hostage, but also their lifeline. One false move, and the fragile balance would shatter, and when it did, no palace walls could protect them. For weeks, the uneasy balance in Tenochtitlan held. Cortés and his men lived inside their palace, Moctezuma remained their guest, and tribute flowed in as if nothing had changed. But under the surface, resentment grew hotter every day. To the Aztec nobles it was unthinkable, the emperor reduced to a hostage. To the priests the gods were being mocked, and to the common people the Spaniards' greed for gold was impossible to ignore. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. The trouble began when the Spaniards demanded more and more treasure. Cortés ordered Moctezuma to collect gold and the emperor complied, hoping to maintain peace. But every new tribute made the Aztecs seethe. Gold to them wasn't just wealth, it was sacred, tied to the sun. Watching the strangers melt down golden ornaments into bars felt like watching them desecrate the heart of the cosmos. And then, in 1520, things spiralled. Cortés had briefly left Tenochtitlan to confront a rival Spanish expedition on the coast. He left behind a commander named Pedro de Alvarado in charge. Alvarado was brave, yes, but also rash, hot-tempered and greedy. While Cortés could be calculating, Alvarado was blunt force, and that bluntness was about to set the city on fire. During the festival of Tocatl, the Aztecs gathered in the great plaza to honour their gods. Drums pounded, dancers in feathered costumes spun in circles, singers raised their voices to the sky. The air smelled of incense and flowers. It was a celebration of life and the cosmos. But to Alvarado, it looked like a threat. Thousands of warriors, unarmed for the festival but strong and angry, crowded into the square. He feared an uprising, or maybe he just saw a chance to seize more treasure. Either way, he acted. Without warning, Alvarado gave the order. Spanish soldiers charged into the plaza, swords flashing, spears thrusting. They cut down dancers mid-step, drummers mid-beat. Blood spilled onto the stones where flowers had just been scattered. The music ended in screams. It was a massacre. Sudden, brutal, and unforgettable. The square, once filled with song, became a killing ground. When word of the massacre spread, Tenochtitlan erupted. Citizens shouted in rage. Warriors grabbed weapons. Priests called for vengeance. The Spaniards, once tolerated guests, were now murderers. Stone after stone was hurled at the palace walls. Spears rattled against gates. The drums of war thundered from the temple tops, echoing across the city like a heartbeat turning furious. Inside the palace, panic set in. Spanish soldiers scrambled to defend the gates, firing muskets and cannons. But for every warrior they struck down, more filled the streets. Supplies dwindled, food grew scarce. The once proud conquerors huddled inside their quarters, surrounded by a city that wanted them gone. It was a reversal none of them had expected. The hunters had become the hunted. Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan after defeating his Spanish rivals on the coast, only to find the city in chaos. His palace was under siege, his men worn down, his allies shaken. He tried to salvage the situation. He brought Moctezuma to the balcony, asking him to speak to his people, to calm them, to remind them he was still their emperor. Moctezuma, dressed in regal robes, raised his hand to the crowd. But the people had had enough. Instead of bowing, they shouted insults. Stones and spears flew through the air. Some struck Moctezuma himself. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he was fatally wounded by his own people, others that the Spaniards killed him. But one thing was certain. The emperor who had hesitated too long, who had tried to balance gods and men, fell in that moment. The voice of the empire was silenced. With Moctezuma gone and the city rising in fury, the Spaniards knew their days in Tenochtitlan were numbered. The spark had become a blaze. War drums shook the air, canals filled with canoes ready to cut off escape, and warriors massed on every bridge. The empire had awakened, and its wrath would drive the Spaniards into one of the darkest nights of their lives. The city was on fire with rage. After Moctezuma's fall, the fragile thread of peace had snapped. Cortés and his men were trapped inside their palace, surrounded by an ocean of warriors. Supplies were gone, nerves stretched thin, drums thundered from temple tops day and night, a heartbeat of war that shook the Spaniards awake even in their sleep. Cortés knew one thing for certain. They could not stay. They would have to escape the city or die inside it. The plan was desperate. They would leave at night, silent and swift, moving across the causeways that connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland. The darkness, they hoped, would shield them. Soldiers packed what they could carry, food, water, weapons, but many could not resist greed. They stuffed bags with gold, heavy bars and ornaments, weighing themselves down. In a way, the treasure they craved most was about to drown them. On the night of June 30th, 1520, rain began to fall. The city lay cloaked in darkness, streets slick with water, torches flickering dim. Cortés gave the order and the soldiers crept out. Horses clopped softly on the stones, cannons groaned on makeshift sledges, Tlaxcalan allies marched nervously beside them. The causeway stretched ahead, narrow and broken by bridges. Behind them, the palace faded into shadow. For a moment it seemed the impossible escape might work. But Tenochtitlan was awake. A woman drawing water from the lake spotted the shadowy column slipping across the causeway. She raised the alarm, her cry carrying across the water. Drums erupted again, louder than ever, beating from temple tops. Conch shells wailed. Canoes surged from the darkness, filled with Aztec warriors, their paddles slicing the water like knives. The night of sorrows had begun. The first attack came swift and furious. Warriors hurled spears and stones from canoes. Arrows rained down from the darkness. Spaniards stumbled, muskets firing into the night, smoke and sparks vanishing into the rain. Horses reared. Soldiers slipped on the wet stones. Screams echoed from the black water as men fell into the lake, weighed down by their stolen gold. The causeway became a slaughterhouse. Bridges along the causeway had been dismantled by the Aztecs, leaving gaping breaks. The Spaniards carried makeshift beams to span them, but under attack the crossings turned chaotic. Men pushed and shoved, horses stumbled into gaps, and whole groups toppled into the water. Canoes swarmed, warriors dragging soldiers down, obsidian blades flashing in torchlight. The lake itself seemed to devour the invaders. Cortés fought to hold the line, his sword flashing as he urged men forward. Around him, cries of pain and terror filled the night. Some soldiers cursed the gold they carried, dropping it into the water to lighten their load. Others clung to it, sinking faster as they drowned. The rain poured harder, thunder rolling above, as if the heavens themselves were judging the scene below. By dawn the survivors staggered to the mainland. The scene was grim. Dozens of horses lost, cannons abandoned in the lake, hundreds of soldiers and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies dead. The causeways and canals of Tenochtitlan were littered with bodies, the water red with blood. Those who escaped collapsed on the shore, exhausted, wounded, and broken. Cortés himself wept under a tree, mourning the disaster. History remembers it as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. But even in defeat, the Spaniards were not finished. They had survived, barely, and survival meant another chance. Cortés swore vengeance, vowing to return stronger, with more allies, more weapons, and a plan to starve the city into submission. The night had broken him, but it had also hardened his resolve. For the Aztecs, it was a great victory. proof that their gods still watched over them. For the Spaniards, it was a reminder that conquest would not come easily. La Noche Triste was not just a battle. It was a turning point, a night when greed drowned men, when an empire struck back, when tears and blood mingled in the rain. The survivors carried its memory forever, a scar etched into their souls. And though Cortés would return, stronger and more ruthless, the shadow of that night never left him. It was the moment when conquest turned from dream to nightmare, and the final act of the empire began. The survivors of La Noche Triste limped through the valleys, soaked, hungry and hollow-eyed. They had left half their company in the lake behind them, horses gone, cannons gone, gold gone, even their pride lay drowned. Yet somehow they kept walking. Cortés, pale but defiant, led them like a ghost commander. His men whispered that they had been cursed, that the gods of Mexico had turned against them. But still they marched, because what else could they do? The Aztecs, meanwhile, did not let them leave easily. War parties harried the retreating Spaniards, showering them with arrows and stones, forcing them to fight step by bloody step. The Spaniards, desperate and wounded, fought with their backs to the wall. Many times it seemed they would be finished. But then they staggered into Tlaxcala. Their old enemies turned allies. The Tlaxcalans, who had lost thousands of their own on that night, chose not to abandon them. Instead, they opened their gates, offered food and shelter, and gave the Spaniards a chance to breathe again. In Tlaxcala, Cortés proved why he was still dangerous. Where another leader might have broken, he adapted. He reminded his men that survival was victory. He promised vengeance, not just for themselves, but for the thousands of Tlaxcalans who had died alongside them. He spoke not as a defeated man, but as one plotting the next strike. His ability to rise from disaster gave his soldiers the strength to keep believing. Reinforcements arrived too. From Cuba came fresh soldiers, more weapons, more horses. Some came willingly, chasing rumours of gold. Others came reluctantly, dragged into Cortés's gamble, to the ragged survivors of La Noche Triste. These reinforcements looked like a second chance, a way to replace what had been lost. Cortés welcomed them with open arms, and quickly bent them to his will. But perhaps the greatest reinforcement wasn't men, it was disease. Smallpox, carried by one infected African slave, swept through the valley like fire through dry grass. It ravaged Tenochtitlan, killing thousands, including nobles and warriors who might have stood against Cortés. Entire families were wiped out. To the Spaniards, it looked like divine favour, proof their god had cleared the path. To the Aztecs, it was a silent horror, striking without warning or mercy. Cortés also turned his attention to engineering. On the lakeshore at Tlaxcala, his men built brigantines, small ships that could be carried in pieces and reassembled on Lake Texcoco. With them, the Spaniards could control the water, cut off supplies, and turn the Aztecs' greatest strength, their city in the lake, into a weakness. Day by day, planks were cut, nails hammered, sails sewn. The sound of construction became the heartbeat of their recovery. All the while, Cortés stitched together new alliances. Town after town, village after village, he sent envoys, sometimes offering friendship, sometimes showing force. Many who'd suffered under Aztec tribute saw their chance for revenge. Warriors flocked to his side, swelling his army until it was more native allies than Spaniards. Cortés was no longer just leading a handful of Europeans. He was leading a coalition, bound together by resentment of the empire. In Tlaxcala, survivors healed their wounds, Spaniards practiced with their weapons, Tlaxcalans trained in new tactics. Horses recovered strength, cannons were polished, sails prepared. The scars of La Noche Triste remained, missing faces at every campfire, empty spaces where friends had been. But the survivors turned grief into fuel. "We will return," Cortés promised, and they believed him. Aztec messengers brought word of the city's struggles, smallpox thinning the population, Moctezuma dead, his successor Cuitlahuac, leading the resistance fiercely but already weakening from illness. Tenochtitlan remained proud, but it was battered. Cortés heard the news and smiled grimly. The time would come soon. The city that had thrown them out in fury would face their return in fire, so the broken army was no longer broken. From disaster they had forged steel. From humiliation they had drawn resolve. Cortés had rebuilt not just an army, but a plan. Stronger, sharper, and more ruthless than before. The march to Tenochtitlan would begin again, but this time the city would not see a handful of strangers. it would face an army of thousands backed by ships, cannons, and vengeance. In the spring of 1521, the Spaniards returned. Not the ragged survivors of La Noche Triste, limping and broken, but a rebuilt army. Cortés marched with nearly 1,000 Spaniards, thousands of Tlaxcalan and other native allies, horses, cannons, and most importantly, 13 brigantines, small ships ready to dominate the lake. From the ridges above the valley, they looked down once more at Tenochtitlan, this time awe mixed with cold determination. The jewel of the Aztec world would now become a battlefield. The brigantines were carried piece by piece from Tlaxcala, across mountains and valleys, until they reached the lake. There, they were reassembled and launched with ceremony. As their sails caught the wind, Aztec warriors on the shore stared in disbelief. The Spaniards now had control of the water. Canoes that once ruled the lake suddenly faced ships with cannons and steel-tipped prows. The city's watery shield had become its trap. The siege began with the cutting of the causeways. Cortés ordered his forces to seize and block the 3 great roads that connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland. Every day, battles raged at the bridges, Spaniards and Tlaxcalans pushing forward, Aztec warriors counterattacking with furious strength. The causeways became tug-of-war lines of blood, with men falling into the water on both sides. Inside the city, the people endured. They tore down bridges to block the Spaniards, filled canals with barricades, and fought with a courage that shocked their enemies. Women carried food and water to warriors on the front lines. Priests prayed at temple tops, urging the gods to deliver the city. Even as hunger grew, their pride kept them standing. Tenochtitlan, they believed, was the heart of the world, and the heart would not fall easily. But hunger was merciless. With the brigantines cutting off supply routes, food could not reach the city. Canoes carrying maize were sunk. Fishers were captured. Slowly famine crept into Tenochtitlan. People ate grass, bark, and whatever scraps they could find. Disease followed hunger, and the once proud metropolis began to crumble from within. Still, the battles never stopped. Every day the Spaniards advanced, and every night the Aztecs struck back. Warriors hurled spears from rooftops, ambushed patrols in narrow streets, and fought with a desperation that seemed endless. Cortés himself admitted their courage was unmatched. The siege was not swift, not easy. It was slow, grinding like 2 giants locked in a death embrace. The temples became strongholds. From the top of the Templo Mayor, Aztec warriors rained arrows and stones, taunting the Spaniards below. Captured Spaniards were dragged up the steps, sacrificed before their comrades' horrified eyes. The sound of drums and conch shells carried across the city as hearts were offered to the gods, a grim declaration that the Aztecs would never surrender. For the Spaniards, it was both terrifying and enraging. Cortés pressed harder. Street by street, canal by canal, the Spaniards and their allies destroyed the city. Buildings were burned, temples toppled, causeways torn apart. Canoes sank in flames as brigantines prowled the lake. The city that had once gleamed like a dream began to look like a ruin. Still, the Aztecs fought on, every block a battlefield, every alley a trap. By summer, the siege had dragged on for months. Disease, famine, and constant fighting had drained the city. Corpses floated in the canals. Streets stank of death. Yet even in this misery, the Aztecs refused to yield. Cortés marvelled at their spirit, even as he ordered the final assaults. It was not just a war for land. It was a war for survival, for identity, for the soul of an empire. The siege of Tenochtitlan was one of the most brutal in history. It was not a single battle, but a slow suffocation. A city of water and stone, once the envy of the world, reduced to ash and silence. Yet in its fall, the Aztecs left a legacy of defiance that still echoes. The Spaniards would claim victory, but never erase the memory of a people who fought to the very last breath. By August of 1521, Tenochtitlan was a shadow of itself. The city that had once shimmered like a jewel on the lake was reduced to ruins. Canals clogged with wreckage, temples burned, corpses floated in the water, and famine gnawed at those who survived. Yet even in this nightmare, the Aztecs still fought. Block by block, street by street, they resisted. For nearly 3 months they had held back an army larger and better supplied. Their courage seemed endless, but courage cannot feed the hungry. Cuauhtémoc, the young nephew of Moctezuma, had become emperor in these desperate months. Barely in his 20s, he led from the front, rallying warriors, encouraging his people, refusing to bow. His name meant descending sun, and he lived up to it, burning bright even as the day of his empire sank. Spaniards and Tlaxcalans came to fear him as a fighter who would never surrender, no matter the odds. The final battles raged in the narrow streets. Brigantines patrolled the lake, blasting canoes apart. Spanish soldiers advanced with Tlaxcalan allies, tearing down houses to clear paths. But the Aztecs refused to quit. They ambushed from rooftops, leapt from alleys, and fought with obsidian blades until their arms gave out. Even children carried stones to hurl at the invaders. It was no longer about winning. It was about refusing to yield. Famine pressed hardest of all. With supply lines cut, food vanished. People ate weeds, bark, and leather straps. Mothers wept over starving children. Priests still burned incense at temples, but even the gods seemed silent. In the streets, gaunt figures staggered past corpses, eyes hollow. Yet when Cortés sent envoys demanding surrender, Cuauhtémoc refused. His answer was simple: "We will die fighting." On August 13th, 1521, the last push came. Spaniards and Tlaxcalans stormed the final districts, fighting through canals thick with bodies. Cuauhtémoc tried to flee in a canoe across the lake, hoping to regroup. But brigantines closed in, their sails snapping in the wind. Spanish crossbow bolts hissed, oars splashed, and his canoe was overtaken. Surrounded, the young emperor stood tall, refusing to cower. He was captured alive. When brought before Cortés, Cuauhtémoc did not beg. Instead, he demanded death. "Take this dagger," he said, "and kill me now." Better to die as an emperor than live as a captive. But Cortés, calculating as always, refused. He wanted Cuauhtémoc alive, as a symbol, as proof of victory, as a tool to control the survivors. The last emperor of the Aztecs, proud and unbroken, was dragged into chains. With Cuauhtémoc's capture, the fighting ceased. Silence fell over the city. The great capital of the Aztec world, once alive with music, markets and festivals, now lay in ashes. Temples toppled, palaces burned, canals filled with wreckage. The jewel on the lake was no more. In its place stood ruins littered with bodies and the smell of smoke and sorrow. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Aztecs had died, some in battle, many more from hunger and disease. Tlaxcalan allies too had lost countless warriors. Even the Spaniards, though victorious, were scarred and diminished. The conquest had not been swift glory. It had been slow, grinding death. And for every piece of gold they carried away, there was the memory of rivers of blood spilled to gain it. On the ruins of Tenochtitlan, Cortés declared victory. A new city would rise, Mexico City, built on Aztec foundations but shaped in European image. Churches would replace temples, Spanish palaces would replace Aztec ones, and the empire of the Mexica would be written into history as fallen. But no matter how much stone was toppled or rebuilt, the memory of Tenochtitlan lingered, haunting the very streets where it once shone. Thus ended the Aztec Empire, not with surrender, but with exhaustion, hunger, and silence. Its fall was not just the defeat of an army, but the collapse of a world. And yet, even in ruin, the spirit of the Mexica endured. In their descendants, in their language, in the stories whispered down through generations. The Spaniards claimed conquest, but the memory of the empire lived on, bright as the sun that no conquest could ever dim. When the fighting stopped, silence fell over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The once great city, which had dazzled Spaniards and filled its people with pride, now lay broken. The smell of smoke and death lingered. The canals, once alive with canoes, floated with wreckage. Survivors wandered like shadows, hungry and dazed. Victory had been declared, but to walk the streets was to feel the weight of loss. Cortés wasted little time. He declared that a new city would rise from the ashes, Mexico City, capital of New Spain. Spanish masons set to work tearing down temples and palaces, using the stones to build churches and colonial houses. The Templo Mayor, once the beating heart of the Aztec cosmos, was levelled. In its place, a cathedral began to rise. For the Spaniards, it was triumph. For the Mexica, it was erasure. The survivors were pressed into labour. Thousands of Aztec men, women and children hauled timber, carried stones, dug canals and rebuilt the city. Not for themselves, but for their conquerors. The rhythm of drums and festivals was replaced by the clang of hammers and the sound of Spanish prayers. Yet even as they worked, they carried their traditions in whispers, in songs, in the quiet corners of their homes. Disease continued its grim work. Smallpox had already ravaged the population, but now measles, typhus, and other European illnesses followed. For people with no immunity, the toll was staggering. Entire families vanished. Priests tried rituals to drive away the sickness, but the gods seemed distant. In just a few years, the population of the valley shrank to a fraction of what it had been. To the survivors, it must have felt like the world itself was ending, and yet even in this darkness, survival took shape. Many Aztecs learned to adapt, taking new roles in the colonial system. Nobles who once served Moctezuma became administrators under the Spanish crown. Farmers still planted maize, beans, and squash, just as they always had. Women still wove cloth and raised children. Though their temples were gone, the rhythms of life refused to disappear. Religion too transformed but did not vanish. Spanish friars spread Christianity, baptizing thousands, teaching prayers in Nahuatl. Churches filled the skyline, but beneath the surface old beliefs lived on. People blended their gods with Christian saints, carrying two traditions in one heart. To outsiders they were faithful converts. To themselves they were still children of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, even if they now whispered those names only in secret. Cortés himself became governor of New Spain. For a time he was celebrated as the man who had toppled an empire. But even his story was complicated. In Spain, politics shifted, rivals whispered, and his fortunes rose and fell. He grew rich, yes, but also bitter, always hungry for more recognition than he received. In the end, even the great conqueror discovered that triumph did not guarantee happiness. For the Aztec people, the empire was gone, but their culture lived on in quieter forms. Nahuatl remained spoken across the valleys. Poems and songs survived, written down in codices and carried in memory. Traditions of food, farming, and family endured. Even as Spanish Mexico grew, the spirit of the Mexica slipped through the cracks, too strong to erase completely. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover the stones of Tenochtitlan beneath Mexico City. Murals, statues, and foundations told stories the conquerors could not bury. The past still whispered from the earth, reminding the world that this was not just a place of conquest, it was a place of resilience. The city of water and stone, though broken, had left its mark forever. So the aftermath of the conquest was not just destruction, it was transformation, painful, tragic, but also enduring. The Aztec Empire fell, but the people lived on. Their language, their art, their stories, their spirit, all survived, reshaped but unbroken. Conquest had changed the world, but it had not silenced it. The voice of the Mexica still speaks, across centuries, reminding us that even in loss there is survival. History doesn't end when the last sword falls. The conquest of the Aztec Empire lived on, reshaping the centuries that followed. For Spain it was a triumph that filled royal coffers with gold and silver. For Europe, it marked the beginning of a new age of empire and expansion. And for the Mexica, it was the start of a long struggle to survive within a world remade. The legacy was not simple. It was complicated, messy, and full of echoes that still ring today. In Mexico, the legacy was everywhere. Mexico City rose from the ruins of Tenochtitlan, a strange blend of old and new. Spanish cathedrals towered above buried temples, but beneath the streets, Aztec foundations remained. Walk the city today and you still feel it, the heartbeat of two civilizations layered on top of each other, whispering through stone. The conquest also shaped identity. For centuries, Spaniards told the story as a tale of glory, a handful of brave Europeans defeating an empire. For the descendants of the Mexica, the story was one of tragedy and resistance. Over time, these two narratives merged into something uniquely Mexican, a heritage of both conqueror and conquered. Pain and pride became part of the same national memory. Religion carried its own legacy. The old gods no longer stood in temples, but they never truly vanished. Instead, they found new forms. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, became a symbol of faith and unity, blending Catholic devotion with echoes of older traditions. Christianity spread, but it wore colours painted long before the Spaniards came. For Spain, the conquest set a pattern. The gold and silver of the New World fueled wars, trade and empire building across Europe. But wealth came at a cost. Inflation swept Spain, fortunes were squandered, and what seemed like endless riches often slipped through their fingers. The conquest was both triumph and trap, shaping the destiny of an empire that would one day fade itself. Globally, the fall of the Aztec Empire was part of something even bigger. the Columbian exchange. Foods like maize, chocolate and tomatoes spread to Europe, forever changing diets. Horses, cattle and wheat came to the Americas. With them came disease, conquest and cultural fusion. The world grew smaller, tangled together in ways no one in 1521 could have imagined. But the deepest legacy was in memory. Stories of the conquest became legend. Cortés was remembered as a cunning hero by some, a ruthless destroyer by others. Moctezuma became a tragic figure, caught between worlds. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, was remembered as a symbol of resistance, a young ruler who refused to bow. Over time, statues rose to him, honouring the spirit of defiance more than the reality of defeat. In modern Mexico, the conquest is not just history, it is identity. Festivals, murals and school lessons keep the memory alive. Pain is part of it, but so is resilience. To speak Nahuatl today, to celebrate Day of the Dead, to eat tamales and mole, all of it carries threads of the Mexico world. The empire fell, but the culture endured, woven into the fabric of Mexico's heart. The conquest also changed how people thought about power. For Europeans, it showed that mighty empires could fall to small, determined groups, armed with steel and faith. For indigenous peoples across the Americas, it was both warning and inspiration. A reminder that even the greatest cities could be undone, but also that resistance carried dignity even in loss. And so the legacy of the conquest is both sorrow and survival. The fall of the Aztec Empire was a turning point in world history, a moment when two worlds collided and neither walked away unchanged. Even now, standing in Mexico City, you can feel it. The stones, the songs, the stories. The empire fell, but the people endured. And their endurance, more than the conquest itself, is the true legacy.